If by chance you haven't seen this, most likely you thought that this V-twin engine will go into this bike, but as I said earlier, this bike's already finished. So now around all this, I'll make a frame, make a homemade gearbox, make a front end, wheels, gas tank, and everything else, and I'll get to experience what's it like to ride a motorcycle that you've created entirely by yourself, including the engine. From the very beginning, I intended to fully build a homemade motorcycle, a new frame, a new fork, a homemade gearbox, and a homemade engine. I began with the engine, so the next step was the transmission. The engine will sit in the frame like in a Harley-Davidson, and so the gearbox must be positioned accordingly to the engine position in the frame. Making all the gears and shafts from scratch is at least an irrational waste of time, because in the end I would end up with exactly the same gears and shafts as the ones I took as a basis. And it makes sense to build from scratch only something that you either don't have on hand, or it's very expensive, or very difficult to get, or it simply doesn't exist in nature. Therefore, as a donor, I consider two transmissions. First from an Иж motorcycle, and a second, of course, from a Dnepr, because I have a whole bunch of them. The good thing about an Иж gearbox is that I would get the correct rotation at the output, meaning all four gears would rotate the wheel forward in the right direction. Whereas with a Dnepr gearbox, I would get reverse rotation at the output, I mean all four gears would rotate the wheel backwards. But I personally don't like the Иж training in terms of its design, simply because it seems to me much more complicated than the Dnepr training. Plus the gear shift system in an Иж gearbox, these floating back and forth gears stuck into each other with these stumps, well, let's just say I don't like it. While a Dnepr transmission already has serious beefy shifter collars, which are durable, plus the design of a Dnepr gearbox is incredibly simple. As a result, I took gears and shafts of a Dnepr as a basis for the homemade transmission, a couple more gears from an Иж gearbox, and in the end, I got this. The gearbox isn't finished yet, it's about 60% of the whole job. In the next video I'll make the shifter drum, we'll make the whole shifter mechanism, a clutch release mechanism, and a starting mechanism, meaning a kickstarter. I began by digging up a Dnepr gearbox with a butchered housing and eviscerated it. Exactly from this transmission I took out the bushings from my V-twin engine's cam chest. Then, thanks to a great person, I got an Иж transmission. In general I was brainstorming for quite a long time about how to make a Dnepr gearbox to rotate in the direction I needed at the output, and what's more, how exactly to hang an Иж clutch on it. Now I'll tell you a little about the clutch, I mean why I took an Иж clutch as a basis. In fact, everything's quite simple here, because first, I admire the operation principle of old Harley clutches, and Иж clutch basket is kinda similar in principle to Harley's. And second, I'm honestly very curious about whether an Иж clutch will work dry. I mean, yeah, we all know that it works in an oil bath, so I was wondering whether it will work without any oil, and just dry. Yes, its clutch plates are designed to work in oil, they have special outlets so the oil can sling out. I'll take it all into account, modify the clutch, and we'll find out whether it will work or not. So I cut off a part of the Иж main shaft and ground off the splines on it, then machined this piece of shaft to the clutch rod hole diameter in the Dnepr main shaft and pressed the Иж shaft into it. Later, when I decide on the width, I'll weld it together with stainless steel and it won't go anywhere. With the clutch, half the problem solved, which means we need to deal with the rotation at the output in the proper direction. Since I decided to make a chain drive to the wheel, I took the sprocket gear from the Иж gearbox and selected another gear that matched its pitch. The second gear must be placed in the Dnepr secondary shaft instead of the reverse gear, which means the good old cutting splines with a grinder goes in action. You'll ask me, why did you choose a chain drive to the wheel? Because I've never really ridden a chain drive before. I mean, I rode only driveshaft bikes my whole life. And a second thing, the motorcycle with this engine and this gearbox, as well as the engine itself and the gearbox itself, I want to make as simple as possible, so it has an absolute minimum numbers of units and parts. Accordingly, using a chain drive to the wheel will save us a driveshaft, U-joint, final gear, flexible coupling, I mean a whole complex assembly which requires maintenance. Yeah, I'm just lazy. In general, I pre-measured everything and ground off part of the splines in the secondary shaft so I could then cut new splines for the Иж gear, machined it to size and marked the locations for the future splines. After the good old cutting of splines with a grinder, I drove the gear on a shaft and it's happy to be there. And not even being surprised that in the end it had no wobbling, I knocked out the countershaft bearing race from an Иж block, also provided to me by an awesome person. In the end, the internals look something like this. Then I had to machine 5 bearing seats, one of which has to have a seal seat and a snap ring groove. I machined 2 of these seats from a steel bar, but for the rest I didn't want to waste the bar, so I decided to make them from a pipe. For this I took a thick-walled pipe, glued some welding on the inside, machined it to the size of the bearing, and got these seats. This way I saved the steel bar, 80% of which would have simply gone to shavings. So I have the seats, which means I can start slamming the case together. With a smart look on my face, I got the approximate dimensions. Back when I was making plates for the engine, I made one more large plate from 6mm thick stripes just as a spare, and now it'll go for use. Cut it into pieces, front and back, and as sad as it was, cleaned the rust from them. Then took all the micrometers and laser levels out and straightened these plates. But in order to weld the seats to them, they had to be straighter than perfect after hitting them with a hammer, so I welded them to a pipe and faced them on a lathe. Seeing this, Captain America will throw away his shield. Next I need to make holes for the shafts. And yes, these are holes, not orifices. I'll make them in my favorite way. Drill a bunch of holes, knock out the middle part with a chisel, and give it a round shape with a file. Then press the bearings into the seats, set them out and tack them. Then cut off the tip of the secondary shaft and machine the tool imitating a bearing, so when welding the seats they wouldn't distort. Then welded the seats and pressed the tool out. Did the same to the second plate, but with the third seat I had problems from the very beginning, since the gear I had slammed in there was hitting its bearing against the bearing of the secondary shaft. Not against the bearing seat, but against the bearing itself. And without thinking twice, I also ground the bearing race itself. So in the future, when I need to go through the transmission, the race of the new bearing will only have to be ground a bit with the grinder. Next I positioned the... tertiary shaft gear and tacked its seat, and welded up all the seats. It was time to make the case. Having taken the measurements, I again robbed the pile of scrap metal in search of suitable metal. I have a deficit of thick sheet metal, but I have plenty of thick steel stripes, so as always I'll make a plate out of them. Cut pieces, chamfered, and welded them. This will be the bottom of the gearbox, and I made it like the front and rear pieces from 6mm plates, because it's the bottom that the gearbox will be attached to the frame with. Then I started working on shift forks, and a rod requires 2 seats that gotta be tacked to the covers. Machine them, set them out a little, and tack them. Then, since everything's ready on the inside, I can start covering. One side on which the load is less, I made a 4mm thick metal, and a second on which the tertiary shaft will be installed, I made a 5mm metal. Having tried the glamorous method, I chose the folk one and bent the plate into the shape I needed, then tack welded the plate. Did the same thing to the other side and then welded it solid. The tertiary shaft gear has lost all its appendages, which made it more compact. Next is the tertiary shaft itself. I cut it off from an ish counter shaft, ground off its splines, machined the seat for it, and began to set up this tertiary shaft in the case. After some minor modifications with the milling grinder machine, I tacked it. The mini housing of the tertiary shaft gear was also made of rusty junk, cleaned of rust, fitted in place and welded. I left a small gap on the back, but I'll cover this place with a lid, so if something happens, the tertiary shaft can be knocked out and replaced. And next is another one of my favorite dishes, flanges. Marked it the same way, cut it out of rusty metal, cleaned it and fitted it. Then drilled holes and welded guides to the cover. Cut threads on the flange and welded nuts on the back for additional strength. Then bolted the flange to the cover, put the cover on and tack welded the flange to the case. This time remains to trim off the excess and slightly refine the appearance. The most important thing in refining the appearance, not to overdo it. Also left small ears on both sides, which in the future may be needed for the shifting mechanism. Having the engine and gearbox, I have to make at least the rear wheel, after which I can take the jig out of the storage, put the engine, transmission and wheel onto the jig and start making the frame around all this. Therefore, after the second video about the gearbox, we'll have a video about the wheels, after which I'll take the jig out and we'll begin to sculpt the frame. Speaking of wheels, the rear rim has been ready for about a year and a half or two, and it's an ordinary 16-inch rim out of a Voskhod bike, which I widened by welding 2 metal strips into it. Now it's 3 inches wide here, and I even started to clean the welds, but then I just got too lazy to grind along the entire diameter, so I left it like that, and that's exactly the way it's gonna be. Also, I'll add about the gear ratios. If suddenly you're wondering about how I calculated these gear ratios, so from the Dnipro secondary shaft to this gear on the tertiary shaft there will be a normal gear ratio, well, I'll tell you that I didn't calculate anything. In fact, here on a piece of paper I tried to write something, but I threw it all away very quickly, because personally I think that the best way to calculate gear ratios is in practice. So when it's already driving, then I'll play with all these sizes of sprockets and so on. Along with making this piece of iron, some issues were being resolved about other pieces of iron, and you'll learn about this in the future. In the meantime, I want to thank you for your enormous support. Special thanks to my family for their support and patience. Thanks to Kane for the huge support. And as always, thanks for your time. I'll catch you in the next video.